This is Darwin to Jesus. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the question, what does it mean if morality is subjective? How would that impact society and the way that it functions? What would justice look like? What would progress even mean? Recently, my friend Ryan and I had an in-depth discussion on these topics in a Twitter space, and we covered it all in detail. It was a really insightful conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Hey Ryan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. This is apparently the joys of X's desktop app. As soon as I booted it up on my phone, it works perfectly.
Yeah, that can happen sometimes. Did you see my invite to co-host?
Yeah. Sorry, let me. There we go. All set.
Okay, awesome. Hopefully that will be the end of the technical difficulties. Thanks everybody for waiting. I was trying to send him a mic and it just wasn't working for some reason. So hopefully that will be the only problems that we have tonight, but probably not. Anyway, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Doing well. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah, so have I. So do you want to just chit chat for a few more minutes and then we'll get started?
Yeah, we can let people filter in. For those who are not familiar with me, I'm Ryan Mullally. I'm a lawyer and a former teacher and a father and a philosophy student. And I spend probably more time than I should arguing about philosophy and morality and religious philosophy in particular on X. And I reached out to Darwin because a topic that comes up all the time on this app is objective morality. And there's kind of this undercurrent in some of the conversations that are had about it that it somehow doesn't matter whether morality is objective or not, that it would all be the same because people have to figure it out, and whether it's objective or subjective, we all have to figure it out together, so who really cares whether it's objective or not? And I just don't think that's right. I don't think you do either, Darwin. But I think it's kind of an undercurrent that's worth exploring.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this is a totally new topic to me. I've never really thought about morality before, so I'm excited to get into this. Kidding for anybody that knows me. I I think about morality quite a bit. Have you actually had a chance to read my moral argument, Ryan?
I've not read it. I heard you talking about it with, I think, atheists. I haven't had a chance to
Yeah.
read the whole thing though.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, it said it took. I asked him about it just the other day. He said he read it, and he said it took him 2 hours to read the whole thing. So I told him, well, it took me about 25 hours to write it. So
There you go.
yeah,
I'll have to save
so
some
I think
time.
it's about even.
It's arguing for the existence of God from objective morality, right?
Yeah, it's actually a deductive argument
Okay. Well, I'm gonna
rather
have to
than
look
an
forward to that. That
abductive
sounds
argument.
fun.
Yeah, yeah. If you ever do get around to it, let me know what you think. And just for the people that I see requested, it's just going to be me and Ryan for the first 30 minutes or so. We're going to kind of set the table with the topics, and then after that, we're going to open it up to everybody. So just make sure that you write down any questions or any notes that you have while we're discussing, and then we'll open it up to everybody. And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But just to make sure we get all the topics settled and out there, it'll just be Ryan and I for the first few minutes or first 30 minutes or
Yeah.
whatnot. Does that sound good to you, Ryan?
Sounds great. Yeah, I think it's helpful just to get our thoughts out, and then we can get into questions with the topics a little bit more explored, so that we know what we're getting
Yeah.
into.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see here. You kind of already introduced yourself. You said you're a deist, right?
Yeah, and I think that's probably why this question comes up for me so much, because if you think about a deist perspective versus a Christian's perspective, we're going to agree on a great deal. So we agree there is objective morality. We agree that objective morality is reflective of God's nature, and that's going to be how you what you're trying to ascertain when you're figuring out what objective morality is. But as a deist, I'm agnostic on the question of revelation. So I don't have that tool in my toolbox. So when someone says to you, like I haven't had this conversation with you, but I would imagine as a theist, if someone said to you, "Oh, well, is there objective morality?" You would say yes, and then you'd say, "Well, they say, well, how could you know what it is?" And you would say, "There's a tradition of revelation in which people were told what it is." And that crosses the divide between the ontology and the epistemology. As a deist, that is not an option that's open to me. So instead, I need to start talking about how I think humans can go about ascertaining what natural law is, what objective morality is, without the tool of revelation. And invariably, I get the question at the end where they say, "Well, how's that different?" If you're trying to figure out what natural law is, you're trying to figure out what objective morality is. Well, that's what we moral relativists are doing too. We're just here, we're trying to figure it out. Isn't that the same thing? And that stumped me for a bit, but the more I thought about it, I don't think it's the same thing at all. I think it's very different to assume that there is an answer to the question and admit that you may not know it than it is to say there is no answer to the question and we get to make it up together. I think that's a very different worldview.
Yes, I completely agree. And real quick, I think it would be really great if you fleshed out what you mean by a deist, because not I think there's a lot of people that are likely listening and that will listen that don't really know what a deist is. And I think there are a few different versions of it as well. So would you mind really fleshing that out, like how you view deism? And also, you should definitely follow Alex Straight if you're not already. He's down here listening and he's a deist. So you guys are both deists. You should follow each other. Anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. And I would encourage actually everybody in the chat to follow each other. If you're interested in this conversation, you're probably interested in a whole bunch of other stuff that people here talk about. Yeah, so I'm a deist in what I would call the maximally broad term, meaning after a lot of soul searching, determined that I believe in God, but I'm pretty much agnostic beyond that, and I'm trying to figure it out. And I'm open about that. Like, I don't think I know these answers, but I think that I know what the questions are, at least the first round of questions. And I'm trying to do my best to be thoughtful and self reflective about it. I think more traditionally, deism takes some stronger views. Like, for example, what I would call like a natural deist or a skeptical deist would say that God exists, but God either lacks the power to intervene in the world or lacks the inclination to intervene in the world. So they would say that God exists, but they would be actually opposed to revelation, whereas I'm agnostic towards revelation. So as regards to Christianity, it leaves me warmly inclined to Christianity. I think that I'm delighted to learn more about it and hope that I can get a lot out of studying the Bible and trying to become more informed. But I'm not committed to any particular dogma or doctrine that would accompany those texts.
So, is it fair then to say that you believe that there is a God that's involved, but you're just trying to figure out which God right now and you haven't nailed it down yet? Is that fair or no?
I think it's more along the lines of, and I was actually stunned that the Pope said this, but when the Pope said that all religions lead to God, I don't think that it's which God. I think, I'm at heart a perennialist, meaning that I agree with the Pope. I don't know why he said that, because as a leader of the Catholic Church, that's a very strange position to take. But ultimately, I think the path of introspection and the path of looking for God leads to God. And that doesn't mean that all religions are equal. That doesn't mean that all practices are equal. That it's very possible to be led astray or to have practices that are counterproductive. But I don't think there's multiple gods. I'm not trying to pick amongst many. I think there's one, and I'm just trying to figure out as much as I can about him.
Okay, well, awesome. I want to spoil it for you. It's the God of Christianity, but you know I'm going to say that.
Well, there we go. That settles it.
Yeah.
I
We
think,
should definitely talk about this offline though. I'll send you some stuff maybe.
yeah,
But I do think that
absolutely.
there are a lot of yeah, I think that there are a lot of great reasons for Christianity. I know it's not the topic of tonight. I just am saying that real quick, but
No, no, I'm
anyway,
happy to look at those. I think for me,
yeah.
Christian. I'm when I say I'm warmly inclined to Christianity, I think that Jesus taught what is basically the most important moral lesson that can be taught, which is that you're going to live your life. There's going to be all kinds of ups and downs, and you're going to do some things you're ashamed of. But at the end of your life, you're going to be asked whether or not you want to come home, and you have free will, and you should say yes. And I think that's an important point, and one that was never articulated in religion prior to Christianity. Which and that sort of thing I find intuitively incredibly compelling. I have a little bit of a harder time with the historic claims. So I guess like on a kind of philosophical level, I'm very warmly inclined to Christianity. But then you have to get into to be a Christian. I think you have to really be able to say, I believe in the factual event of the resurrection, not just I'm warmly inclined to the philosophy.
Unless you want to be like Jordan Peterson.
He really won't
No,
answer.
I think he
He
actually
won't
did
answer the
affirm
question,
that.
and I think it's so silly because that's to me that's what Christianity is. You have to say yes to that.
Yeah,
It's not optional.
right. No, I think I actually heard Alex O'Connor nail him down, and he actually said that if someone had been recording while Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days, Alex O'Connor was very, very specific. He did say, yes, on the recording, it would have shown Jesus rise from the dead. So,
Okay,
but that's the only time I've actually heard him give a coherent or real answer to the question. So,
I'm glad he did because I'm fond of Jordan Peterson, but
yeah, I am too.
sometimes he dances around that question to an extent where I get where he's coming from. It's a tough question because it's often asked with a strategic, if not malevolent, purpose, and he's not trying to get himself into a position where he says something that's difficult for him to unpack later. But even so, you can't spend as much time talking about religion as he does without answering that question.
Yeah, I completely agree. Anyway, so do you want to go ahead and get into it? I'm
Yeah,
gonna let
yeah,
you somewhat take the wheel here because it was your idea to do the space, if
sure.
that sounds good. But I do have the topics written down, but I kind of think that it would be better if you kind of guide us through where you want to go here, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think if maybe if you'll indulge me, I'll start with a story. I was talking with some friends of mine who lean further left than I do, and they were ragging on the pro-life scene, and I kind of I wasn't trying to get into the weeds about it, but I asked them if they've ever heard like a good version of a pro-life argument. And what I meant by that wasn't a religious argument because I knew that wouldn't sway them at all because they're not religious. I meant like an argument that I thought would appeal to them and would be difficult for them to refute. And so they said they hadn't. So I gave them what I call the argument from humility, which is not. I'm not taking a position on abortion here. I'm not saying that I know what the magic number is months wise, conception wise, or anything like that. Um, but I think you can say if you take the question seriously, on one hand, you have the freedoms of women, which are of central importance in society because the control of one's body is, if you can't control your body, you can't control anything else. So that is an important legal right that should be honored in society. And on the other hand, you have the lives of the unborn and the prospect that at some point during a pregnancy, the unborn take on moral weight and moral significance. And that disposing of them is murder. And I know that I don't know when when that line is crossed. There's ways you could look at it, there's arguments you could make, but I'm not certain. I'm not certain because I have no way of being certain. But I do think there's an answer. So if I'm humble, I must say that while both are weighty concerns, murdering children is in many senses the weightiest concern. So there must be some restriction. I don't know when it should be, but there must be some, because to say that there should be none is to say that I have so much certainty in my own understanding of when humans acquire moral weight and significance that I'm going to bet on it, and I'm going to say, I'm going to just let it ride, and there's going to be some outcome, but I'm sure it's going to work out okay. There's going to be no people who were killed in this process. And they did not like that. They didn't react. They didn't react well to it, as you can imagine. They couldn't refute it, but they didn't react well to it. And as they were struggling with it, one of my friends said, "Well, a fetus isn't a person." And I was like, "How on earth could you assert that? Like, on what basis? Like, how could you claim to know that?" I'm not saying you're wrong, even. I'm just saying, how could you know that? And what I realized with kind of a moment of horror is that this is the difference between a moral realist and a moral relativist. He said a fetus is not a person, but he doesn't believe there is a fact of the matter. So, because there's no fact of the matter, there is no answer to the question of whether a fetus has moral weight, he's free to take any position he wants. He can say whatever strikes his fancy because there isn't an answer. He can't be wrong. Whereas for me, when I really weighed it out, at the very least, I have to be humble about my ignorance because I do think there's an answer. I think it matters that you get it right, and I'm afraid that I'm wrong. And that is a very different worldview, and kind of the heart of what I was hoping to talk about today, about how do you build a society or come to understandings of what our norms should be if the people you're speaking to don't believe there is a moral fact of the matter?
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think that that's a great way to kind of start. So just to make sure I understand, your argument there was basically saying that let's err on the side of caution. Is that correct? Like it's very serious to take an innocent human life. So even though we should value the freedom of a woman, let's err on the side of caution because we really don't know exactly when a human has value. So because we don't really know, let's just err on the side of caution. Is that kind of what you were saying there?
Yeah, I think humility demands that. Like, I think that that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you ascribe no moral weight to the autonomy of pregnant women, because you absolutely should ascribe tremendous moral weight to that. But the variable is, how much moral weight do you give to the life of the unborn? And obviously, the further the pregnancy progresses, the more weight it will develop. So, if you're humble about it, you have to admit that there should be a restriction at some point. At minimum, there should be a restriction at some point, because there must be, unless you're going to take the position, like my friend did, that a fetus is just not a person at all. And I don't know how you could be sure of that unless you don't think there's an answer. So you're free to take whatever position you want.
Yeah, to me, when even when I was an atheist, I always thought that morality was objective. There was no question about it in my mind. And I don't understand why anybody says that morality is subjective. I'm like, do you really know what that actually means? Or when they say it's relative, I'm like, do you really know what that means? And it normally when I actually talk to people, they immediately start refuting themselves when I start asking them questions, like a moral relativist will be like, well, I think that morality is relative. And I say, really? Okay, so then do you think that Hitler did something wrong? Because in his country, he was the one that got to make the rules. So relative to him and his rules, he didn't do anything wrong. And they said, well, no, I think it was wrong, and I'm like, okay, well, then you're not a moral relativist, are you? And people will say, well, I'm a moral subjectivist. And I'm like, okay, so that means that you could decide tomorrow that you were going to go murder somebody and it would be fine, right? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, well, then you're not a moral subjectivist. You know, it's like these guys, but they just don't understand, or I think they just don't care. Honestly,
Yeah,
I
I
think they just don't
wonder.
care.
I wonder if it's maybe like there's it's a collection of non-transgressive personalities. Like if I'm being honest about myself, I'm a rule tester by nature. Like I'm not somebody who, you say color in the lines and I automatically do it. I need to know why, and then that might work out or not. But I actually will ignore a rule if I think it suits me, and if I think it's fair to do so. And I think that when people talk about moral relativism or moral subjectivism, they kind of imagine that everybody is somebody who likes to color in the lines. So they say something like, well, we as a society come to an agreement. And that's true. We as a society do come to agreements about moral issues all the time. But if you're a more transgressive personality, you're going to have these moments where you say, well, maybe I should break that rule. And if the only thing that's stopping me is that there'll be consequences, then then I'll break it if I think I can get away with it and the risk outweighs the reward. And that's a pretty different statement. It also means, by the way, if it's just a creature of consent, if morality is just a creature of consensus, that if I can convince enough people that my position is right, that becomes the morality. So you can just change the rules of the game. And that's a whole other kettle of fish, too, because then you're kind of basically allowing the political class, who, let's be honest, tend to be somewhat narcissistic and sometimes dangerous personalities, to dictate what morality is, because they're the ones who dictate what consensus is. And I don't think we want to give that up.
Yeah, another thing that is really interesting about the idea of morality being relative is, if morality is just relative to the society, then really the idea of progress is incoherent. Because if you're pushing for quote unquote progress, that actually means that you're immoral because you're looking for change. But you're trying to change what is moral in your society. So whatever you're trying to change makes you immoral. So there's no progress to be had. But all of these people that talk about progress are all moral relativists. And it's like, guys, hello.
Well, that's a really important point, because like again,
Yeah.
as a deist, I look at morality as essentially uncovering natural law and discovering it over time, which is like discovering the laws of physics or the laws of mathematics. Like we get it wrong constantly, and we try to figure it out, and over time we get better at it, and rules start emerging that are universal in application. And you can say with a straight face, I believe this is a moral obligation, that it should apply to everybody. So progress absolutely makes sense in that context, because we are progressing. We're figuring out what the natural law is over time, and we're getting better at it. I, on to your point on relativism, there is no possible progress, and you get to pick the unit of measurement every time you want to change the rules. So you can say, "Oh, well, I used to care about utility, but now I care about human flourishing," and no one knows what human flourishing means, but I'm going to define it this way, so that means that we have progress. And it all rests on this kind of shaky foundation. It doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's no foundation at all as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's literally just totally relative, and it's not relative to any fixed point. It's just relative to whatever you want at the moment and whatever I guess other people happen to want at the moment. It's all just sheer nonsense, and nobody really believes that
No,
as
no.
far as I can tell.
I think honestly, I was so taken with the guy you were speaking with recently, the atheist, who is one of the most honest humans I've ever interacted with, is because I've never heard someone admit that his worldview is kind of an illusionary sham, but he thinks it's the best he has, so he's going with it. Which is that's a heck of a thing to admit. That takes some real some real cojones to come out and say that. But he's right. Like if you're going to say that morality is relative or subjective, you're going to say that our fundamental experience of morality is wrong and is an illusion, and that we should build society in some different way. And you're building it on the illusion, which is tricky because again, I quite like that guy. He seemed like a really nice guy, but I was struck by how the things I like about him the most are his honesty and the way that he clings tenaciously to traditional US and Christian ethics, despite the fact that he doesn't believe they're real things. But I wonder, like, if you tell everybody it's an illusion and you convince them all that it's an illusion, how long do you think that's going to last? Are you going to have multiple generations who are going to abide by illusionary moral restrictions? It just doesn't seem like it is sustainable to me.
I don't think it's sustainable. But I mean, the only way it might be is because we all actually know. So even when you tell people that these things are illusions, they know deep down that they're not illusions, and so they just keep operating as if they're real. Because I think that we all do know that these are not illusions, that they're real. Just like most subjectivists and relativists are only subjectivists and relativists in name. As soon as you start pressing them, you find out very quickly that they don't believe what they say. It reminds me of this friend that I used to have. He was an agnostic, and he said that he was a moral anti-realist. And I said, okay, so you don't believe that there is right and wrong. You think that the idea of moral truths is incoherent. And he said, yes. And then I see him a few days later talking about homosexuals and saying that if he sees that homosexuals are being oppressed, that he would give his life to stop it, that he would sacrifice his life to stop homosexuals from being oppressed. And I messaged him and I said, hey, I thought you said that you're a moral anti-realist. And he said, yeah, I am. And I said, well, what's this over here? You're talking about how you think it's so wrong to oppress homosexuals that you would literally die to prevent it. And he said, yeah, I don't see the problem. And I said, really, you don't see the problem? It seems like you find this behavior of oppressing homosexuals so egregious, so wrong, that you would be willing to sacrifice everything that you have to prevent it. And you're telling me that you don't think there's any such thing as right or wrong? I said, I don't believe you. And he got so upset with me that he blocked me.
I believe he blocked you. That sounds that sounds about like how that conversation would go. Yeah, I
Yeah.
honestly, I'm coming to the conclusion, not with any joy. This is something that fills me with a little dread, if I'm going to be honest. That in prior generations, what we talk about now as a culture war was a conflict of ideas between people who believed in them. Like you had different versions of moral realism that were competing, and that was the fight for ideologies and the fight for what the world was going to look like. I suspect that the upcoming battleground is not going to be the same fight. It's going to be team more objectivist versus team subjectivist, because it doesn't seem possible to build a lasting society on the foundation of everything being an illusion, and to the point about your friend or ex-friend, on the foundation of everyone getting to decide independently for themselves what is the highest morality. That doesn't seem workable to me, if only because most of them are going to be wrong, but also because I think one of the things that we've learned over time is that humans are flawed and selfish, and we really do struggle to identify the highest good and to put it above our own needs. And if we're not encouraged to do so, and in fact, if people start telling you that there is no highest good, in fact, it's all illusionary, eventually someone's going to say, well, what's pretty convenient? If what I want is the highest good, wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be lovely if what I want is the highest moral purpose? And I think you start to see that kind of narcissistic view playing out in our politics these days. And it's a dangerous it's a dangerous undercurrent. I don't know how you can build a society where everybody gets to decide what is God.
Well, to me, it is very similar to saying that truth is relative, okay,
Yeah.
or that truth is subjective. It's like, okay, if you think that truth is subjective, if somebody says to me truth is subjective, obviously, number one, I'm not really going to believe them. But let's say I did believe them, how am I supposed to have a conversation with them about what's true? Because my truth, what I think is true, is not going to be what they think is true. So any disagreement between us is there's not going to be an actual truth to be had. It's not like I'm looking at someone and I say, okay, I think that person is 6 foot, and they look at the person and they're like, well, I think he's 6'3", and then we can go and measure the person and figure out, okay, how tall is he, who's right, are we both wrong? If you're a subjectivist, if you think that truth is subjective, then you're right when you say he's 6'3", and I'm right when I say he's 6 foot. There's no actual truth that we can move towards or move away from. There's no objective truth, so
Mhm.
there's no point even talking about truth or who's right or who's wrong. It's all just nonsense. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. I wrote an article on my X page if people are interested in a very similar topic. But kind of what started me down this road on some level was when the birth of my first child, and I started asking myself, okay, I'm a former teacher. How do I teach her that truth is better than falsehood? Not not like you don't want to get caught lying, you don't want to get in trouble at school, but that truth is better than falsehood, intrinsically better. And that's not as easy as it sounds. It sounds simple. It's actually a pretty complicated question. But then it occurred to me that, I worked in schools for a long time. I know a lot of people who do elementary education, and they're subjectivists. So how do I, and they're friends of mine. It's not like they're bad people, but it struck me as incredibly difficult to rely on people who don't believe there is truth to teach my daughter its value. And that kind of set me down. In fact, I think that was what set me down the path to deism and going back to religious philosophy and trying to work through these problems, because it is a very difficult and thorny question, and quite frankly, it's not one that every parent should have to work on their own. We have societal mechanisms like religion that are designed to solve this problem, but they're in a moment where they're not as ascendant in the culture as they used to be, and relativism is quite a bit more ascendant than it ever has been.
Yeah, so my thinking on this, and I know we're getting off the rails just a wee bit here, but my thinking on this is that truth is the real thing and falsehood is the perversion of what
Hmm.
is real. So it's kind of like a person with a shadow. I have a shadow, but my shadow is dependent upon me for its existence. Like I could go into a very well lit room and my shadow would no longer exist and I would be fine. I wouldn't even realize that I didn't have a shadow. But if something happened to me, that would be detrimental to my shadow, right? My shadow could not exist if I got obliterated. So my shadow is dependent on me. I am not in any way dependent on my shadow. And I think of falsehood as the shadow of truth. So falsehood is the perversion or it's not real, whereas truth is the real thing. So it's the good, and then you've got this lesser shadow aspect of truth, which is when it gets perverted away from its true self. So the good is the real, and then the perversion it would be not as good, depend in degrees.
Well,
That's the way I think of it, anyway.
it's a good analogy because it takes you way back to the allegory of the cave, where if you figure out that everything people are looking at is shadows and they're not looking at the truth, and then you free yourself and try to tell them that they're looking at shadows, they're going to argue with you because they're happy looking at shadows. And I, I I think the thing about that is when you're looking at shadows, you get to decide what it means, and that's comforting, because who would ever want to be wrong? That's one of the great horrors of belief in objective truth or objective morality is the inescapable conclusion that you're probably wrong about something very important, and you should try your best to be less wrong, but you're not gonna you're not gonna hit the mark every time, and that requires real humility to face that, to say, oh, like I think there is a fact of the matter and I'm going to try to figure out what it is, but I could be dangerously wrong and I have a responsibility to try to avoid that. And that just seems totally different to me than someone saying, well, it's whatever I say it is, so conveniently whatever I think is true happens to be true. Isn't it nice how that worked out?
Yeah, and another thing that's really interesting to me about these people that say that they're moral subjectivists is how they act morally outraged when you do things that they don't like. And it's like, but I'm doing what I think is right. So why are you upset at me? It's like if morality really is subjective, like you're saying, well, then you have your morality and that's subjective to you. And I have my morality, which is subject to me. So I get to make my morality. You get to make your morality. So you've got your morality over here. I've got my morality over here. So why are you getting mad at me for what I've decided is good? If I want to go and be racist or lie or go steal, I think that those are all good things. So why are you getting upset with me for my standard that I made up? It's like I could just as easily get mad at you for the standard that you made up, but it's all nonsense. It's all just stuff that we just make up based on what we want to be true.
Well, and that's the not to veer too much into the Jordan Peterson territory, but that's the real risk, right? Is that as long as people believe that there is something true, then you can push for truth itself. You can say that we should do this because it's true, and here are my reasons why you should believe it's true. If nothing is true, and it's just consensus, it's just all you have is subjectivism and what people agree to do, then the postmodernists become correct. And the way to enforce your morality is power, not truth. So, in a world where everything is subjective, the correct way to enforce your subjective morality would be to band people together and browbeat people into believing what you believe and indoctrinate them, or imprison them or take control of political power, however you would do it, because all that matters is the power. What's true doesn't matter. In fact, nothing is true. And I don't know how you could avoid that outcome in a society where everyone believed that there is no truth and morality is subjective, etc. That would be the only way things could be.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I think, that if morality is subjective, then laws are nothing more than people who have power forcing other people who don't have power to live the way that they decide. And there's nothing more to it. It's just we have power, so we get to force you to comply with our preferences of behavior.
Yeah,
And there's nothing really moral about it.
and look, like
It's just,
some law clearly is just a question of agreement. Like if you're in a, I think I gave you this example over DM, but if you're in a town and the town passes a zoning law and says no houses in the town can have red roofs, I don't think anyone's going to argue that that's some reflection of divine truth or anything like that. That's literally just a town has a preference about houses look. It's a local consensus. But on the flip side, at the end of World War II, when they were doing the prosecutions of the Nazis and there started the Nuremberg trials, they were faced with a very difficult question, which is they really wanted to prosecute the Nazis, and they wanted to punish them according to law. They didn't want to say we get to punish you because we won the war and have power over you. They wanted to be able to punish them because it was correct, because it was true that they were deserving of punishment. But basic legal principles, you can't punish somebody for a law that didn't exist when they took the actions they took. If burglary is not illegal and you burgle from someone, I can't punish you for burglary. The law has to be on the books when you commit the action. Otherwise, it's ex post
well,
facto.
not only that. Not only that, Ryan, but I think that a lot of the things that they were doing were not only just not law, but totally in compliance with the law, like
Certainly,
lawful.
certainly the law of Germany, right? So,
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
yeah. So they had to appeal to a higher law. They had to say, no, actually. And they appealed to natural law. They said, it is inherent in the natural order, in natural law, that genocide is reprehensible, that anyone would know that this is reprehensible, and that anyone who's complicit in it can be punished because it is not the sort of thing a human should do. And by appealing to natural law, they were able to ground those prosecutions in law, but also in truth rather than merely in power. And this is kind of a atmospheric point. It's not what they spent the trials on, certainly, but it's a very big difference. And I think that that points to the difference between the areas where I think we can agree there is subjective agreement and consensus about more minor things. But then there are the big ticket items where there does seem to be a fact of the matter.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that when you talk about serious laws, not just speeding laws or things of that nature, but serious laws, like what you brought up with Nuremberg or cases of rape or these sorts of things, there's something about these things. I mean, you're literally sending someone to jail for potentially years or life or sentencing them to death. And it's not, to me, it can't be just you're going to die because you did something that the majority of people happen to not like at this particular point in time. It's got to be something more than that in order for it to even make sense to do it. I mean, imagine a lawyer actually saying that, saying, Your Honor, we need to send this person to the chair to be electrocuted because he did something that the majority of people happen to not like right now at this particular time in this society. I don't think that that would be a very strong case. I think for the most part, whenever you're talking about serious crimes, it's always implied that there is an objective standard and we're trying to base our legal system, and it may not be directly in line, but the idea is that we have, for the most part, gotten our laws in accordance with natural law, in accordance with what is actually right and wrong. And then we are doling out true justice. And it wouldn't be true justice if our laws were not in accordance with that standard. And I think we all have this idea too, because we have this concept of an unjust law. And it's like, well, what is an unjust law? An unjust law would be a law that doesn't actually match what we know to be actually moral and good. So, going back to Germany, they had a law where you had to report on any Jews that your neighbors might have in their houses or that sort of thing. And that would be an example of an unjust law, because that's actually wrong. Even though it's the law, to do such a thing would still be wrong.
Yeah,
And I think we all understand this intuitively. We all understand that a law can be unjust. And it's like, well, how can a law be unjust?
yeah, yeah. And
Unless there's a transcendent law that is supposed to be in line with.
I think that's entirely right. And I think the more it's the higher order, maybe that's the right wrong phrase. No, I'll go with it. The higher order the law is, the more likely it is that it must comport with natural law and our intrinsic sense of what's just and right. When I gave that zoning example, that's a very low order law. But when you talk about, taking when the state's going to take somebody's life, that's a very different question. And this is why I remember I was watching Justice Scalia, would rest in peace, give remarks, and he was talking about his view of the Constitution. And for him, like Justice Thomas, the founders were a mix of Christians and deists, and they were believers in natural law. So when they are delineating specific rights. They're doing it because they believe it was their best understanding of what the contours of natural law are and how that must limit the government in order to avoid tyranny and injustice. And so for Scalia, when he says, I mean, he's a law and order guy, or was. He wasn't somebody who was, by personal inclination, predisposed to being lenient on criminals. But he actually wrote some of the most defendant friendly rulings in the Supreme Court during his time in office because he believed that the Constitution had a set meaning, that it had a truth to it. And if the truth of the Constitution was that you can't have cruel and unusual punishment and you can't have illegal search and seizure and you can't do these tyrannical things, that compelled an answer even if he didn't like the answer, which is of course entirely different than looking at the Constitution and saying, well, there's no truth, meaning is relative, it means whatever I think it means, so isn't that convenient? The Constitution says whatever I think should happen. And that difference in perspective is a microcosm of the objective subjective discussion we're having now, and that's playing out across society.
Yeah, absolutely. So, are there any other aspects of this that you want to flesh out before we open it up to everybody?
No, it was a great discussion. I think we went a little bit over, so I think opening up to questions would be fantastic.
All right. And do you have any goals as to when you want to call it a night?
Let's see how it goes. I probably can't spend more than an hour on this from now, just because I have stuff going on. But I don't know how involved the conversation will be. So open to taking it as it comes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking to probably wrap it up by 10 or sooner. So that would
Yes.
be another hour or so. So, okay, cool. All right. So, for everybody that's listening, I'm going to go ahead and start accepting mic requests. So, go ahead and request to speak. Please just be respectful, even if you disagree. And let's have a good conversation. And thank you, everybody, for being here. So, I've got some speakers being added now. Just a minute. Oh, also, if you have anything that you'd like to say, go ahead and put your hand up and we'll just call on everybody in order. So as soon as you get that mic, put your hand up and I'll write your name down. All right. So first we've got uh I hate the Antichrist. Hey man, good to see you again. What's going on?
How's it going, Daniel?
It's going great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Doing pretty well. I just had some commentary I wanted to add on to the a few statements that are made. It's not all completely relevant to the main subject, but it's about the stuff you guys have talked about. So I just wanted to put down a note that a Christian can know that personhood is granted at conception because Jesus became Jesus at the moment of the incarnation, which was the moment of divine conception. So that's how we can be. That's how we're 100% certain about that as the moral position there.
Yeah, no. I think that and I think I said this earlier. One of the hurdles that I have to cross as a deist is that I don't get to rely on revelation, or at least I can't rely on revelation in good faith because that's not part of the tradition that I'm representing. So I absolutely respect the point you're making. It's not a position that's open to me.
Not yet anyway. We're going to change that though, right?
Well, God
All
willing.
right, and then this
Yeah, all in God's time.
second
Go
thing
ahead.
is it's more of a comment really. Uh, so this is just from my personal observations. It seems to me that what moral relativism ends up being is it is a lack of the desire to forgive other people for their mistakes. So someone who does evil in moral relativism is generally seen as doing evil because the thing they think is good is not good according to society relatively. So what ends up happening is moral relativists end up identity for sorry, they have no concept of another person thinking something is wrong and then doing it on purpose anyway. That concept ends up disappearing over time as moral relativism continues. And that's how you get statements like, we need to teach men not to rape. Like, sorry, every man knows not to rape. Like, sorry, like, sure, teach it. It's good to make sure that that is a statement that people know about, but like, it's such an obvious thing that people know not to do it, just, sacrosanct. And so anybody who has ever done that has done so violating their own morality. And that view can only be achieved under moral objectivism. So the relativistic position, therefore, or sorry, that's a second statement. So comments on that first, please.
I think there's actually even a more I'm not sure I disagree with that, but I think that there's even a more insidious motivation there, which is if you haven't read him, Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions is one of the all-time great political theory
Mm.
books. But one of the things for the moral subjectivist is that they'll say, well, there's no answer, but we all can agree that this is what we should do. So because all reasonable people would believe this. So then if you
Yes.
disagree with them, you must be either unreasonable or insincere or
Yeah.
grifting in some way.
Yeah.
And
It's
for
like
you,
smuggling a no true Scotsman fallacy.
exactly. But for people who rely on tradition, for their worldview. That's not a problem for them because the traditionalist is in many ways more humble. They're saying, I don't know the answer, but I do know that my forefathers have been working on this problem for a long time, and through the bloody arc of history, they came to solutions that more or less worked, and I shouldn't discard those arbitrarily. I would need it's not that I'll never change, but I need to really know that what you're proposing is better, not just new. And that's just a
Yes.
radical act of humility. And I think that it's that the lack of forgiveness you mentioned is part of it, but also that lack of humility, where they're saying, no, 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 I have this great idea, and because I'm so clever, I'm sure it is better than what everyone's done in human history up till today, because I'm so clever. And if you don't think it's clever too, you must be insincere. And that's a deeply
Exactly.
insidious position.
And
All
then
right, Austin,
my
did you have
last
anything else
statement
there?
here. Yeah, I have one more statement, and I think Daniel, mostly you're gonna love this one. You might even start clapping. So this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and hearing this conversation kind of solidified my position here. There's no such thing as moral relativism. It doesn't really exist because the very root of moral relativism is a morally objective claim that it's objectively wrong to violate your own relative morals.
I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna have to think about that. What do you think, Ryan? You think he's right?
I think I had a conversation with a philosophy student last week where he made, I think he made I don't, I'm trying to make sure I get this right because it's not my position, so it's a little hard for me to parse it out correctly. But I believe his argument was something along the lines of, he doesn't think that there's any such thing as objective morality, meaning morality that's independent of human minds. But he does think that there's epistemic objectivity, meaning if we agree to the rules of the game, we can then agree that it is objectively best to do the following and that you have an obligation not to do the following based on that consensus to the rules of the game. Um, I, and so he said that counts as as a type of objectivity, which it strikes me more as a semantic argument than a real one on some level. Like it's
Yeah,
objective
it is.
because we like, yeah, like if you and I are playing chess, it is objectively true that the pawn can't move 8 squares. But we also could just design a different game.
Yeah, and I love it when people say this. I used to, so you don't know my history probably, but when I was an atheist, I tried to figure out how to ground objective morality for 3 or 4 years, and I completely failed as an atheist. And this was one of the avenues that I went through. I was like, okay, well, morality is like chess. So we basically agree, and there are rules. But then I realized, yeah, but what about people that don't agree to the rules? What about people that say, I'm going to go over here and make up my own rules? I'm going to go rape all the women that I want. Have they done something actually wrong? And I'm like, yes, they have. So this doesn't work. It's like when people say this, I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, but what about people like the Joker? Like, I understand that people can agree to stuff. I want to know, when someone does something, are they actually right or wrong, regardless of whether they agree with rules or not? That's what I want to know. That's what I care about. Are they actually right and actually wrong, or are we just making stuff up here? you know
Yeah, well, I think the
so
very best version of that argument, the subjectivist, well, I would call it subjectivist. This philosopher would not call it subjectivist, but the best version I've heard was, God, I wish I could remember this professor's name, but he was debating Dr. William Lane Craig, and they were discussing objective morality, and he made the argument
oh, I
that
know who you're talking
there is
about.
an yeah, there's an objective morality that's based upon Rawls' veil of ignorance. So if you imagine that you have no idea what kind of person you are, and you're trying to design a society, and you would then imagine that you're perfectly reasonable, then you could design a society that was perfectly reasonable, and those norms would be objectively correct. And that was a tough argument for me to unpack. And I thought about it a little more, and I thought, well, you know what? It's actually not enough that you're perfectly reasonable. You'd also have to be omniscient. Because if you weren't all knowing, then you could come up with a rule that seems reasonable to you, but you're mistaken and it's actually not reasonable. It actually causes all kinds of chaos. And it's not actually enough that you would be all knowing and perfectly reasonable. You'd also have to be omnibenevolent, because you're full of bias and limitations as a person, and maybe you're going to get it wrong. And then I realized the reason I was having a hard time knocking down his argument is how I would like to go about discovering what natural law is. The difference between him and me is I think I'm doing something real, and he thinks he's doing something fake. So, he's the reason that it seems so compelling is that it actually is a pretty compelling argument. He's asking, what would God do? But he's just dressing it up in a way that makes it appear to be removed from that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I wish I could remember his name, because I know exactly what argument or what debate you're talking about. He has a beard, right, and wears glasses.
Yeah, no, I mean
Is that? Yeah.
I love watching Dr. Craig debate, and I normally think he gets the upper hand pretty easily, and that was a tough debate. That guy was very well
I
prepared, had very good points. That was a real tough one, so
He
I
had
would love to
strong rhetoric.
rewatch that.
He had strong rhetoric as well. Um, I There were a few things that he said in that debate, that I was like, I don't know about this. The idea. I know we're kind of far afield right now. I just want to touch on it briefly. But when he says that, well, we can just use our reason, I'm like, yeah, but using your reason doesn't tell you what's good. Where is the good coming from? Just because we can be really smart and be perfectly rational, that doesn't tell us what to value. Where do values come from? Because we could be totally reasonable and there could be no good. There could just be is. There could just be what is. So where is the good coming from? Where are these obligations coming from? Even if we established, oh, here's a value, this is good, it doesn't follow from that we have an obligation to do the good. Where are these oughts coming from? Why ought I help the old lady cross the street? Why ought I take care of my family and not abandon them? um,
Well,
I don't think you're gonna get there.
yeah, no, no, and this is probably a bigger topic that we should get into during the Q&A, but this is the kind of heart of the problem with. I know we use the phrase atheism as a shorthand, but really it's metaphysical naturalism. It's the idea that there's nothing beyond the physical world as we experience it. Because in theory, an atheist could be like a Neoplatonist, and they could believe in Platonic forms of the good, and that actually would, in at least as a matter of philosophy, solve this problem because there is a good that you appeal to. But you can't.
I
What
don't
you
think it would
can't.
solve the obligation problem.
Well, I mean, yeah. Again, this is probably gets thorny. I think what you would define the abstract object of the good as that what one ought to do. So then, to the extent that an action embodies the good, you would have a moral obligation to do it. Again, I feel always weird defending views that aren't my own because I might get them wrong. But I'm comfortable with the shorthand of atheist for metaphysical naturalist because the overlap is so extraordinary. So if anyone, if I offend anybody because they're a Neoplatonist and an atheist, sorry about that, but the one of them out there is probably not worth having to put a 45 character disclaimer on every tweet.
Yeah, just for everybody that's listening, a Neoplatonist atheist is someone that basically believes somewhat the same thing as what Plato talked about, how there are forms. So most atheists are naturalists, meaning that they believe that there's just the material world and there's nothing outside of what we can pretty much observe with science and our sense data and these sorts of things. Whereas the Neoplatonist atheist believes that there's another realm, this realm of ideas. So there's like justice and morality and truth and these sorts of sort of abstract ideas that are just kind of floating in some kind of distant realm. But somehow, and this is the really difficult part for them, somehow this completely different realm is able to affect our realm, which the two realms couldn't be more different because one is like permanent and real, the realm of the forms, and then this realm is always changing. Nothing is permanent, everything is in flux and moving, it's all material. But somehow these two realms are connected, and that's where it becomes very difficult for them to figure out what's connecting them. Whereas to me, it's very easy because God is connecting everything with his
Yeah.
mind, so
Oh, and
we don't
and
have that problem.
and that challenge for them, which is, as you said, a serious one, is child's play compared to the naturalist challenge in rooting ethics in the good, because they, I think, would have to concede, as atheists did, that it would be rooted in what's adaptive, not in what's good or true, because there is no good or true on naturalism. It just is an empty concept. It's just something that we evolved in order to have better survivability, and that, I mean, it's not like that's an incomprehensible worldview, but it's a grim one.
I think it's very grim, but we better get this more
Yeah.
hands here, just so everybody knows the order. It's going to be a poor fellow soldier will be next, and then Cedric, Alex, Kat, and then Michael. So, a poor fellow soldier, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, what's going on?
So a few thoughts on this. If if morality is subjective, then why can't I just do whatever I see fit? Like, what's stopping me from going around and just causing chaos? The problem
So
with morality being subjective is everyone basically gets to be their own little god, and there has to be some form of objective morality, but I don't think we're capable of figuring out on our own because of the depraved state of mankind that is demonstrated throughout Scripture and human history. And Scripture is the answer to figuring out objective morality because it comes from God. And I think if we're going to argue in favor of objective morality, we need to argue in favor of Scripture being objective and true and coming from God.
So there's a
You have any
lot
thoughts on
there.
that, Ryan?
I think the first, taking them in order, the first point you made, if morality is subjective, who's to stop me from doing whatever I want? And the answer is, and I think we touched on this earlier, those with power. Because if morality is subjective, then what is moral is whatever the society consensus is. And if enough
Well, what
consensus
if this
develops,
society consensus to, I don't know, throwing homosexuals off of buildings like they do in Muslim countries? Does that make it moral?
well, that's exactly the point I was making. It's whatever the people with sufficient power to enforce their view on others say morality is, as opposed to some search for what's transcendently true. And yeah, that does strike me as a pretty big difference.
Hey, a poor fellow soldier of Christ. You understand Ryan is also a moral objectivist. He's not making the argument for moral subjectivism, right?
No, yeah.
Yeah, I
I
understand
just want
that,
to.
but he said he doesn't believe that scripture is divine, but how can you know like what is objectively moral if you don't have anything outside of yourself to determine that?
He's trying to discover it the same way that we discover laws in nature. Sorry, Ryan. I know it's addressed to you, but I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah,
trying
no,
to.
happy to.
You can go ahead and answer it.
Yeah, I think that the challenge, and I'm actually undertaking right now for the first time in my adult life, which is crazy because I'm a philosophy student and I've read all kinds of religious texts, but I've actually never read the Bible cover to cover. So I'm in the process of doing that for the first time. So I tweet about that occasionally if you're interested in that. So I'm very open to it, and I'm trying to learn more about it. I think that one of the challenges with Scripture is that people tend to come to it because that's what they were raised in. So if I'm going to be totally honest with you, if I was raised in a religious tradition and then later in my life, as I did, kind of moved from agnosticism to belief, I probably would have defaulted back to that religious tradition. But I wasn't raised in a religious tradition. So if I'm going to be, as my beliefs solidified, then I need to figure out what do I believe, and do I think that Protestantism is correct, or do I think Catholicism is correct? Do I think Lutheranism is correct or Calvinism is correct? There's some variations out there, and working through that without a baseline is challenging, which is why I'm transparent about the fact that I don't have these answers. I'm doing my best to figure it out, and I believe in God, and I'm agnostic beyond that.
I think you would agree, Ryan, that the idea of revelation would make a lot more sense than trying to figure it out for yourself. You're just really not sure. You haven't really committed to any particular religion yet. But would you
Well,
agree that revelation is a much better answer epistemically?
it's incomprehensible to say you believe in God and to also say that if God told you to do something, it's optional. Right? That's incomprehensible. So the the question that I have with revelation isn't one of, if revelation were true, does that create a moral obligation? The question is, did revelation happen? And if it happened, was it correctly captured? Was it correctly translated? Has it been passed down accurately? Those are very thorny questions. They're not. It's not a question of whether or not it would be binding. It's a question of whether or not we know what it is. So it raises epistemic questions for me that I can't claim that I know the answer to, or that I'm even approaching an answer to.
All right. Well, do you want to go to the next speaker then?
Sure.
So next up, we've got Cedric. Cedric, are you there? Can you hear him, Ryan?
No, I can't hear Cedric.
Hey, Cedric, would you mind dropping out and coming right back? We cannot hear you. I'm sorry. Well, maybe we can. I saw a little bit of something there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, I got you.
Okay, cool. So I was wearing these weird headphones, but no, I see we have a lot of hands up, so I'm going to try to go as fast as possible to respect everyone's time. So I just had an argument, and to help like lay the foundation of it, I'm actually going to reiterate something that Daniel said earlier. And I think as a theist and as a Christian, a lot of us run into this, I would say pretty consistently, is, when people make the argument that they're moral subjectivists or relativists, right? They say that, but then when you actually start prying a little bit and answering questions, asking them questions to get to really understand what the foundation for that belief system is, they usually backtrack, right? Like you can bring up all kinds of heinous activities and moral atrocities, and you quickly find out that they don't align with that at all, right? And so I think that's very interesting. But I want to take it a step further, and even like the Antichrist hater and other people have said this as well, is that you know moral subjectivism and relativism, subjectivism and relativism, I do believe is an objective truth claim, right? Like I believe that in order to say, well, I don't believe that morality is subjective or relative, you are saying something that you believe is absolutely true, like it's objectively true to you, right? So even from that perspective, I do agree with the standpoint that it can't be ever really subjective. And to kind of hammer that point home, the reason why or not the reason why, but how I root that is like this. So obviously from a theistic perspective, a Christian perspective, what we believe is that morality comes from the divine, right? It comes from it comes from God, who has a transcendent awareness and law and principles and virtues, etc., that extends not only to the human experience, but to whatever else, any kind of being that he's, ever created. Even the angels, right, were judged by a certain law that they transgressed, right? So like this objective morality is something that God has set in place, right? Well, what I find fascinating is that a lot of people who don't really ponder these questions too seriously, they think that God is some mythical being in the sky, right? They think of like some kind of wizard, Lord of the Rings creature, and they think that if I put this mythical being on the shelf, then I just get rid of God. But that's not actually true. And what I mean by that is this, like, so how am I trying to word this? So this concept of like naturalism, materialism it's a relatively new concept, right? Like people who really don't understand their history, they might think that like for centuries upon centuries, the collective awareness of any given civilization or society, especially Western civilization, but any civilization really, that, people have always kind of been like, I don't know, atheists or whatever. Well, no, that's not actually true, right? Like it's actually a new kind of religion where people try to relegate like the conscious realm, mathematical realm, realms that govern morality and the trend, all this into matter and energy. That's like a new concept that came really from like the Enlightenment period, and then obviously with Darwin, it kind of like gave it, more wings after that. But it's kind of a new thing. And when you put God on the shelf, you don't just put God on the shelf. You put every metaphysical construct and spiritual understanding that man has had that comes from God, including consciousness, free will, morality, like all of these things. Please understand that these are spiritual, metaphysical ideas that come from the awareness that man is a spiritual being with autonomous will over the physical realm, right? Like, if you take that away, I would argue that there is no possible way to have morality, because in order to have morality, you have to have free will. Well, how do you have free will if whatever is going on in this vessel of mine is some accidental projection from atoms that got knocked into each other somehow, going all the way back to the beginning when time, space, matter, and energy just erupted from a singularity accidentally, randomly, spontaneously, and then matter and energy, which are unconscious, morally neutral, non-sentient, unintelligible, blind, just got introduced to heat and an explosion happened, and then some stuff cooled, and then just beings started manifesting. If that's all that there is, whatever man is just atoms. Literally, there's no difference between a man and a sidewalk. we might think of it as being different, but whatever even I am, like the individual, something that we call a soul, like a soul is a spiritual concept. If you take God, you take the transcendent away, you take spirituality away, metaphysics away, what you're left with is there's something going on in this vessel that kind of just happened, and it's just some projection from atoms that are knocking against each other randomly and spontaneously, and you're not actually alive in the legacy that we call whatever being alive is from a spiritual perspective. Like, people don't really follow this worldview to its logical conclusions because, in my opinion, it really makes a mockery of free will, morality, consciousness,
Ooh.
love, virtue, but like all of these things. It makes a literal mockery of if all we are is matter and energy. And I'm gonna hang up and let y'all go.
I mean, you are 100% right. It reminds me of comments that Dr. William Legg Craig made to Alex O'Connor in one of their interviews, where he said that, I mean, I'm going to paraphrase, but nobody's ever been convinced about the truth of a faith claim on the basis of logical argument. That's just not how that goes, right? But the goal of the apologist, when they're on a debate stage or having a conversation like this one, is to point out the heavy intellectual tax that comes with metaphysical naturalism. And you've been pointing out correctly. What's the tax? No free will. Morality is an illusion. The love you feel for your children is just a biological series of chemicals that interacts on your brain. If there was somebody with sufficient power to enact a consensus, whatever that they enact that consensus is good. So if the Nazis won, then Nazism is good. But because the Nazis lost, Nazism is bad. And knocking those down, you're not going to convince somebody to believe on the basis of logic. You just won't. But exposing them to the full ramifications and entailments of their positions
Well, real quick, Ryan,
is often enlightening.
I don't mean to cut you off, but even like logic and reason, right? Well, the naturalist, the materialist, is forced to give me a rational justification on why he believes that logic and reason is possible, seeing that whatever is going on in his brain is the result of an unintelligible, spontaneous, and random process that wasn't designed and didn't even nobody designed it to even perceive truth or logical reason in the first place. Like
Well,
all of these
yeah,
things.
no. The believer believes that the universe is intelligible to humans, and humans can use their reason to learn about the universe, and they believe that because they believe that humans were made in the image of God. The naturalist believes the same thing for no reason, because they just have to presume that's true. And then, their argument is that, well, it's just a presumption I'm making. I'm like, well, that's not a presumption. That's a leap of faith. And it's a profound leap of faith. And yeah, you're right. You need to be able to point out these issues.
To quote the legendary Professor Lennox, right? He said, "Man became scientific because they believed in the intelligibility of nature, and they believed that nature was intelligible, and they believed that because they believed in a divine legislator."
He's fantastic. Good quote.
I think I got it wrong,
Cedric,
but
I love
somebody
what you're saying,
sort of knows what I was
but
trying to say.
we better go on to some other hands. Thank you, though. Yeah, I just want to say, to piggyback for a second on what Cedric is saying. The way that I think about it is, I'm basically holding the atheist's face in the dog poop that is their worldview, and I'm just like, "Are you sure you like this? Is this really what you like?" And I'm hoping that eventually they'll say, "Okay, I really don't like this. This is awful." It's hard. It's very hard because they really don't care about. I think what they say that they care about. you know. So showing them that tax, they don't really care about the tax because if they did, they wouldn't. They're not living as if they believe what they claim. It's just like the subjectivists. They say, well, yeah, morality is subjective, but then you do something wrong to them and you find out very quickly they don't think that morality is subjective. Anyway,
Yeah. Did
let's go
you see
to.
Pete Holmes' stand-up comedy about this? If you haven't seen it, it's
I
brilliant.
don't think so.
Oh, he has this.
No, I don't think.
Let me look at the name of the special. It's called. I don't know the name. Sorry. But basically he tells a joke where he's talking because he's a believer, and he was saying, the atheists make fun of the believers, and you ask them, where did the universe come from? And they say, from nothing. And I say, well, that's a really interesting and magical nothing if everything can emerge from it. And then I ask them, what happens when you die? And they say, nothing. And I'm like, you merge back with your creator? And sometimes
Yeah, I have seen that.
approaching it through comedy is, or memes, as you do, is an easier way to point out some of these absurdities than to get into a 30-page philosophical argument that no one's going to read.
Yeah, well, I like to do the arguments and the memes, but most people just pay attention to the memes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but when people want to challenge me with the memes, then I show them that I actually have done the work and here's the argument. So, all right, we've got Alex, and then it's going to be Kat, Michael, Ryan, Mr. Cassandra, Brian, and Cuckoo Pack. Cuckoo Pack. So, Alex, what's up?
Hey, how's it going, Daniel? So, hey, Ryan, it's
Good.
great to
Going
meet
good.
another fellow deist on Twitter. Apparently, there's like 5 of us.
I know this is a very rare occurrence.
And so Daniel said, "Oh, I got a deist that I'm going to have tonight." So I was super excited, and then I realized it's a trap to talk about morality. But I'm okay. I could do it.
Well, we'll
So,
have to do another conversation where we can actually get into Christianity
oh, I'd
versus
love to.
deism. Yeah.
I'd love to. Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I live for. But as far as morality, if I have to talk about it, so you guys did a pretty good job talking about why it matters that that morality is objective over subjective. And I think I could sum it up. Correct me if I'm wrong. That if subjective morality were true, that would mean that all of us can just go every which way, and we would have no cohesion. And really, it's like our sense of morality that binds us all together. Is that a good steal, man?
Yeah, I think so. And I would just add to that. This is why you start seeing, I think, a little bit of a dangerous trend where people try to ground morality in empathy alone, which is an insufficient basis to ground morality in. It's not that empathy is irrelevant. Empathy is a tremendously useful and adaptive human capacity, and I'm not knocking it at all. But it's not the basis for morality. It's not independently sufficient. And people are appealing to it because of exactly what you pointed out, which is they've realized, if I'm a subjectivist, there's no force behind my argument. No one has any reason to believe me if I admit that I don't even believe me. So I need to ground it in something, and empathy is kind of the tool at hand.
Yeah,
The way that I think of, oh, I just want to say real quick, the way that I think about it is it's as if you're trying to talk about what north is, but there is no actual north. So we all have these compasses and they all just kind of happen to point in various directions, but there's no such thing as actual north. So all of our compasses are, maybe there's a lot of people whose compass seems to be pointing the same direction, but then there are also other people who have compasses pointing pretty much the exact opposite direction, and then this way and that way. And there's no actual way that a compass ought to be. So there might be just a lot of people who happen to have a compass that points in the same direction. Those people all get together and say, well, we all agree. And so you have to align your compass with our compass. But it's all just ridiculous, frankly. So that's kind of how I think about it. There's no actual north, there's no actual right or wrong, no objective standard.
gotcha. Yes, I've heard that before, the compass thing, and that brings me to what I was trying to get at was that for something to be objective, you have to be able to identify its principles or its contingent parts or its philosophy behind it. So, like for instance, either the Earth is revolving around the sun or it is not. And so that would be objectively true, meaning apart from minds, like it's going to be doing its thing whether or not we're here or not. But the thing is, the reason why we can consider that objective is because there are principles that we can see and that we can measure. Newton made calculus to help map the elliptical orbits. We have physics, we have that kind of stuff. So there's foundational principles to what is objective. And so my question is, what are the foundational principles of morality if it's objective?
So that's a obviously like a not even just a lifelong question. That's, you could spend many lifetimes on that question. And I think this is an interesting question because it's going to tease out um, the differences in how a deist might approach that question from the way a theist might approach that question. For me, and as I'm sure you know, there were many deists amongst the founding fathers, and they were trying to figure out what are the principles that must be transcendent and universally true, such that no matter what people vote for in a democracy, they cannot remove them. And that's how you end up with the Bill of Rights. And some of those, I think, really do make a great deal of sense as kind of universally true principles that we've collectively discovered over time, such as you should have the right to think and to say what you think. No one should be able to take that away from you. Or more, I think more recently, even since the time of the founding, I think we've come to the kind of moral discovery as humans that you have a moral obligation to treat people as individuals. That seems to me like the kind of thing that we have discovered over time, but was absolutely not something that we knew in other eras. And I think as a deist, this is a very difficult question because you have to go through some form of contractualism or deontological exercise and kind of work through the philosophy to try to figure out what you think these transcendent principles are, and then test the theory and run the risk of being wrong. On the flip side, if you're a theist, you have revelation as an option, and having revelation as an option certainly simplifies the inquiry because, as I said earlier, if God told you that this is the rule, you would have no basis to disagree.
Yes, so revelation definitely makes it easier, and as deists, like you said, we can't use that. That isn't in our on our tool belt. And I think that the data of like what you said about the founding fathers and the things that we've laid down, you gave kind of a historical argument and also an appeal to our senses. Like you were using actual examples. Like I was writing down notes when you guys were talking, and I was trying to find like the certain statements of morality that you were saying, and I got down that genocide is objectively wrong. I got
Mhm.
Nazism is bad. I got you should help old ladies across the street, and you should help your family. And so, like as an exercise, I think that we could just look at those examples right there, and we can find a commonality. And so we can actually reverse engineer that, and we can take it from like a data empirical perspective on morality because we have so much data. Like when I hear people say that, like, oh well, you need to be omniscient to be able to make a moral claim, well, that's kind of assuming that you're just floating in a vacuum somewhere with no knowledge. Like we have the Library of Alexandria, like at our fingertips nowadays. We have so much data, and therefore we should be able to discern a commonality between all of those moral intuitions that everyone feels. And basically what I think the answer to it ultimately is consent and harm, basically. So the less consent you have, which is a measurable thing, and then the more harm or less harm that you have is also a measurable thing. And that seems to be embedded in everything that people say when they talk about something moral. And so, like, I think it's important to reverse engineer morality and not just it to be edict. So yeah, so I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, and I think this is, by the way, this is one of and I want to be transparent about it because I am a deist. I certainly am delighted to speak to another one and would love to if people were attracted to that worldview, that would be just fine with me. But I think we need to be honest about the pitfalls of the position. And one of the pitfalls of the position is that it's very easy as a deist to fall into a bit of a hubristic position, which I'm not accusing you of, by the way. But the because we don't have a robust tradition in the same way to rely on, it's easy. It's very easy for us to then say, "Well, I'm going to figure it out." And once we embark down that path, there's always the lurking danger that we think ourselves too clever, and that as a result, we abandon tradition too readily. So I think that going back to your claim about consent and harm, it's an interesting theory, and I would be delighted to talk to you about it. I'm not personally a consequentialist, so I don't tend to think about morality in those terms. But I think the larger question is always going to be, how can we make these discoveries while treading carefully and not come to some conclusion that's actually going to upset the apple cart in our haste to be clever and figure it out.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a legitimate pitfall. That's why I think it's important to consult the entirety of human knowledge, and especially with technology nowadays, we can do that. I mean, do you agree that ethics is a legitimate science, well, maybe a legitimate philosophical, maybe even scientific
Oh
study?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that we really have gotten better at it over time. And that's not because what's moral has changed. It's because we've learned what morality is. And we do it collectively, and we do it in fits and spurts. And it's a messy process.
So, one last thing, I just wanted to give my definition of a moral agent because
Mhm.
I think it can be logically said that something is either a moral agent or it is not a moral agent. So the definition would be something that is self-aware and aware of its own consciousness, has the capacity to suffer, and also possesses a will. So if you're in the presence of something that has none of those characteristics, then it's not a moral agent, and it completely changes what you ought to do around it. So that's just my framework. I can let other people talk now.
Yeah. We don't need to get too deep in the weeds on that. The one that stood out to me was self awareness, because that's going to beg the question in a lot of scenarios in which self awareness either has not yet fully developed or has dissipated. Like, for example, if somebody was in an accident and was in a vegetative state, but the doctor thinks that they're going to snap out of it, are they not a moral agent because they have lost the capacity for self awareness? So these are. I think it's an interesting framework, but kicking the tires on stuff like that is really tricky, and takes. That's why we have an academy, because you've got to publish it and get people to rip it apart and put it back together and slowly build it, because it's a tricky thing to do.
Absolutely fair. I'd love to respond, but there are others.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot,
you and I'll
Alex.
catch up some other
Great
time.
to, always great to have you in the space, Alex. I appreciate you being here. And yeah, what you said about suffering, I'm actually in the middle of making a YouTube video about that exact thing. So I hope you'll give it a watch, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it once I finally finish. It's a lot of work making videos. So anyway, next up we've got Ryan, I think. Yeah, Ryan Leaney.
Yep.
Hey, are you there?
Do you guys hear me at all?
Yeah, I can hear you
Yep.
fine. What's going on, man?
Cool. I'm so just putting out there. I'm an atheist. I just kind of saw your guys' space on Twitter. I was like, oh, okay, I'll just sit around and listen to this a bit. It's been
Great.
interesting. It's been a good conversation. Um, but like earlier, like some people have talked about like the idea of like, oh, if we don't have free will, then morality's out the window. And I just want to give you guys like a version of what I would view as evil in a world without free will. Um, and see like and just like mesh your minds against it maybe.
Sure, go ahead.
Yep.
Sure.
All right. So evil is any action whereby the consequences of that action create future actions such that the values that initiated that first action are contradicted by the future consequential action. So like another way of saying this would be the behavior of like the Hatfields and McCoys was immoral because it created a society of back and forth revenge cycle of like back and forth revenge cycles. Um, but the behavior of, say, like Dennis the Menace, like, made some they would make or not Dennis still kind of counts in this, but like the behavior of, say, some other normal rivalry, um would, like, doesn't result in a escalation of earlier, the guy mentioned harm. And so like, I do feel that the avoidance of harm as a value that's like innately available to those that can sense pain.
So,
Mhm.
Ryan,
Yeah.
I think the objection to there being morality in the absence of free will is a little bit more
Mhm.
fundamental than that. So, if you
Yeah.
don't mind me
Mhm.
asking, like, maybe if you could imagine a universe that had no living things in
Mhm.
it, it just had rocks,
Yep.
right? Planets and rocks. That's it.
Yep.
Is there any morality in that universe?
There is no morality in the universe. I would
Okay.
say there's no morality in the universe because there's no consequences that can grow into something that we would call a society.
Okay. And then let's say that I put in to this hypothetical universe a bunch of wind up toys and other kids' toys, the ones like the little dog, they do the flip with the
Hmm.
battery. So now there's a bunch of those. They're all running around and flipping and doing what those toys do. And sometimes they bump into each other and they knock each other down, and some of them break and some of them don't. But they have no say in it. They're just toys. They're just doing what they're doing. Is there any
There
morality
would
now?
still not be morality in that because the when they bump into each other, there's no like there's no consequence to them bumping it for them, like, bumping into each other, such
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
they would then say this person is acting wrong. Like basically, like the like when as they bump into each other, like that would, like, the physics of that reaction would just end. There wouldn't be a future event caused by the soldier, like, turning left instead of turning right.
Yeah. And look, you can make the toys more complicated so that they learn and they try to avoid each other, and sometimes they
Mhm.
don't. And you could get really interesting toys that have all kinds of programming that lets them do all different things. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, for me, um, if there is if there's no free will, it's just toys bumping into each other.
I
That's the problem. Like you need people who are
mm,
culpable and responsible for the decisions that they made. And you can't be responsible for a decision you made if you couldn't have done otherwise. So without that, there,
well,
there doesn't seem
I
to be
would
any
s-
morality to speak
I
of.
would say when you say couldn't have done otherwise, I think there's a a when we say, um like, I morally condemn this action, your opinion in your communication of that is, like, is you trying to wind the toy in a way that will make it so that it doesn't bump into each other. Like, in my view, the basically, like, the in a world where everyone just has free will, then a moral discussion between two agents doesn't ultimately matter, because the consequence of that conversation will be one where the person that I'm talking to just decides that day, oh, I'm just going to forget I had this conversation. Whilst in the non-free will moral society that's discussing morality, the consequences of having that conversation will be a actual moral increase, or more a guarantee of that moral increase.
But I guess I'm just fundamentally confused by the point you're making because when I say something is morally good, I mean it's something you ought to do. And when I say something that's morally evil, it's something you ought not to do. But if
Yeah,
you have no
ought
choice
implies
in the
more.
matter, what are we talking about?
And for I would say the I would say I would say the it would say you are morally I would say you are in this case we are morally ought to do things because the consequences of us doing actions um is is um is such that I guess the best the furthest I can give here is like you mentioned, like the toys knocking into each other. They can knock into each other in ways that are incredibly dull and boring, and they can knock into each other in ways that are interesting and grow into and like complex. I'd say like
Hey, Ryan,
the push is too complex. It is something I'm still like fairly new at this stuff for the most part. So, but thanks for listening for the most part. Challenge me if you
yeah,
Yeah.
could.
can I make a point real quick?
Yeah.
So the way I think about this is you wouldn't be upset with your car for breaking down on you, right? Like if you really needed to get to work and your car just suddenly broke down on you, you wouldn't think you ought to get me to work to your car because you know that your car doesn't have the choice about getting you to work. It's just doing what it's going to do. So it's just a simple matter of cause and effect. This thing happened and this thing happened. You didn't maintain it properly or whatever. There's this malfunction, and the car can't do other than what it's going to do. The engine is broken and it's got to be fixed. Okay. But we don't think about that. We don't think about people in the same way. When we think about people, we do think about you ought to have done. Like when I look at my daughter and she pushes my son down onto the floor, I think, hey, you ought not push your brother down. You ought to be loving towards your brother. You could hurt him by doing that. We think about humans very differently than we think about things like cars and tornadoes because we have this idea that humans can do otherwise, whereas cars and tornadoes cannot do otherwise. So when a car does something that we don't like, we don't blame the car. When a tornado does something that seems egregious to us, we don't blame the tornado. But when a person goes and kills 5 people and he was, not controlled by anything, he just went and killed 5 people, we blame the person and we say, how could he have done this? Because we have this idea that we have the ability to have done otherwise and that we're moral agents. Do you see the difference?
Yeah, I see the difference. I'd say I guess like the key point is it like the key point there is that I see so many people talk about like they like the if we have like if we have like in my view like we have an we still have objective morals. It's just that um we have a let me say we have an objective moral answer, but that we explore subjectively. But since our actual subjectivity is limited by our free will, the or by the lack of our subjectivity is lacked by us not having free will. I tend to see a lot of people take this position where they say Nazis are where like if the Nazis won the war, blah blah blah, this would be the result given subjective morality, when what was happening in addition to Nazism was this massive effort to install like explicit to look at the people's attempts at moral progress and saying, oh no, we can't, no you were not supposed to basically like the Goebbels society, the Goebbels efforts of of like trying of like looking at um the the uh the attempts to I guess to humanize Jews, and they ended up instead like finding using every psychological tool in the book to 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 take them to like install that dogma into them. So I don't know. I haven't fully figured that. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring
Yeah,
that
no,
topic
no,
into that. I'm just trying to like I'm just trying to like in my way I always find that's like the issue is that maybe it's just I'm like stretching things, but I always find dogma to be more of a source of immorality than a source of morality at times.
Well, listen, Ryan, if you'd like to keep talking about this, you're more than welcome to send me at the end. I'd love to continue the conversation, but we do need to get some other hands. So thanks a lot for being here, though. I really appreciate it. And yeah, hopefully we'll keep talking about it. So next up, we've got Mr. Cassandra. Mr. Cassandra, are you there?
I am there. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah,
yep.
All right.
loud and clear.
So I will start out by saying, just as a primer, and to try to hopefully convince people that I'm not actually an atheist. I do believe in something. I think I don't have a good quantifiable, describable way of saying what that is at current, but one of the reasons that I believe in something is that there does seem to be across from really the Code of Hammurabi, even I can't remember what it's called, Code of Herb something or other. It seems like from there on up and in disparate communities who've had very little connection with each other, there's still a lot of grounded rules, especially not only just, the self-preservation type stuff, murder, property, likewise, but there's also a really interesting common thread, again, between people who had really disparate beliefs in different times and different locations of this idea of sinning against heaven or rebelling against heaven or whatever, the religion or the religious high point is. And it's just interesting that so many different people came up with that same idea that there is something greater, and that rebelling against it or working your way against it is bad. So anyway, so I do think there is something there. I'm sorry if I'm speeding through this. I am just trying to save for time. But to argue from the atheistic standpoint, because this is something I've always been interested in, and I don't really feel like I've gotten a super good answer to, though I do have to say Daniel provided me with a really, really, really firm grounding of this very topic. In You sent me a link to a mega thread, which everyone should take a crack at. But if let's just say for a second, atheism somehow is confirmed. I'm not arguing that it should be or would be, but just let's say it is. That would mean that all of the morals that we have, that we're claiming as being objective, were were created and agreed upon by people. They just came up with it on their own. Now, why they would or any of that, that's could be a huge separate topic for debate. But it's an interesting idea that if we were to take for granted that somehow atheism could be provably right, it would mean that despite all those morals being subjective, they align with a lot of other people's, I guess, objective principles, or what they consider to be objective principles. So it's almost like a shared trait across communities. Is it genetic? Is it just, good survival tactics? Who knows? But I do think when we discount that possibility, it does take away from just some of the absolute sheer beauty of the human mind, and it says something about the innate goodness of humanity that, bereft of God, they still decided on these principles that protected each other, protected themselves, and tried to look at the world beyond what we see here, trying to tie a greater value not only to human lives, but to the goodness of human life. So, yeah, that was just. So it's. I think in a way you can have it the best of both worlds, where from the atheistic point of view, yes, they are subjective morals because there's a lot of variety and variance in between, but there are some really firm objective morality, I guess some underpinnings that seem to echo or create their own type of objective morality, even in the absence of a God. And that's all I got.
So can I respond to that? My thoughts that I totally understand what you're saying, but I do have to say I'd be remiss if I didn't. That I think that if there was no God, then really when we have this idea that humans have still like somehow discovered this morality and like isn't it amazing how good we are, lions would be probably thinking the exact same thing about their society, and praying mantises would probably be thinking about the exact same way about their society. When they eat the male head off, as a mating ritual. So really, when you say like, boy, aren't isn't it great? And correct me if I'm straw manning you here, but if that is what you're saying, like, well, boy, isn't it amazing how we've still done all these things in our society, we've looked out for each other. Well, every group of animal that has evolved with a different pattern of behavior would feel that way about their behavior. So there's really
Sure.
nothing special in my view about our behavior. We just happen to have evolved this way, and other animals have happened to evolve in the way that they have, and there's no actual closer or worse way of being. We're just all surviving in different ways.
Yeah,
What do
no,
you think about that, Ryan? Oh, go ahead.
oh no, no, go ahead. I want to hear what Ryan has to say. Man, you've been a fascinating speaker. Both of you guys have given some really good insights tonight.
Oh, I appreciate that. And candidly, you sound like you're an inch and a hard shove away from Team Deist. So maybe I can get you on board. Um, I think you know, to me, first, just as a overarching question, I don't think it's possible that God will be disproven. And I mean that A, because I believe there is a God, but B, because what science does is it proves how things happened and how they are happening. It doesn't give you a why, and it won't give you a why. And these questions are going to remain. What science can do that sometimes chips away at religion or puts it in tension with religion is it can prove that a specific point of dogma is wrong. Like you can get into the age of the earth or different things that where a specific interpretation of a specific scripture appears to be incorrect based off of some scientific evidence. It can do that, but that doesn't disprove God. That at most disproves a scriptural interpretation. And one of I spoke, I hope with humility about the fact that there are some real challenges to the deist position, including the fact that we just don't have a good claim to knowledge about what God is because we don't have a tradition of revelation. But one of the benefits of deism is that it's a flexible and maximally broad view of God that speaks to, I think, what I heard you talking about, which is the tradition of perennialism, where you say, okay, let's zoom out and look around the world, and in everywhere we see people yearning for God throughout history and building cultures and societies that seek God, and it was imperfect. And monotheism is a philosophical ginormous step forward compared to paganism in that regard because it creates the unity rather than the separation and formalizes that. But you see this in the kind of like perennial tradition, and it seems like you're kind of right on the edge of that. So I wouldn't worry too much about God being disproven because I don't think it's possible,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
yeah, and that's a great point. I also don't think you could prove it, even from a scientific aspect of it. Like we might be able to mathematically understand the sixth, fourth, sixth, 16th dimension, whatever. But to experience it would be different. Like even scientifically, we know that we don't see as many colors as say, or don't see as many shades and hues as a mantis shrimp. So the idea that right in front of our eyes right now there are more colors that we'll never see, there is even in the physical world we see these instances of unreachable knowledge, and I can't for the life of me, and because of some just truly weird experiences I've had, both religious and not, I can't imagine that if there's just a way to like look into a fourth dimension and say it doesn't exist, because just by getting to that fourth dimension you kind of confirmed it exists. So I don't want to get too hung up on that. But I do agree with you, yeah, that it's science is the why and not, or the how and not the why. Love that. Um, The one thing I did want to say, though, in terms of like arguing from the atheistic position, which I think is just an interesting thing to argue from, is if we were to say 100% that, let's say maybe that Thor comes down and we're like, okay, Thor exists. And Christians came up with that all on their own. Okay. And I use the specifically Christianity because I do think there's all of these really beautiful messages in there. And I just think it's just to kind of clarify that it's like I do agree on the baseline with Daniel where yeah it would be nice to think we're all just super nice when it could just be survival, but when you kind of zoom in on things like Christianity, which have wonderful, wonderful moral lessons to teach, and really beautiful ways of expressing that. To think that a human mind would just invent that, would see that kind of base need for mutual survival and then elevate it to a level that really encompasses charity and mercy and forgiveness. Like those are things that are not found in a lot of those other older texts, right? So even if we did that in purely the atheistic perspective, I think that just says again something really innately moral about the human mind, that it's constantly seeking to fine tune, update, and appeal to people's better nature. But yeah, anyway, so that's the last I'll say of it. But thank you guys for letting me get my argument out there. It was really great to hear what you guys had to say.
Well, thanks
No,
so much.
appreciate the kind words.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, man. It's great to actually get to talk to you. Finally, we've sparred many a time in the comments, so it's great to actually hear your voice and everything. And I'm looking
Yeah,
forward
man.
to talking
Likewise.
to you more.
Likewise, dude.
Awesome. All right, so next up we've got Brian, and then it's going to be Cuckoo Puck, and then we're going to end with John if he's not too shy to talk, even though he doesn't have his hand up. So, Brian, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for doing this. I found you on Twitter a while back and really enjoyed that. And um, yeah, just this is something I'm a Christian. This is something I've been pondering my entire life. And to me, the challenge from an atheist point of view, atheist or non-Christian point of view, I've done my best to try to step out of my mindset and think outside of my own beliefs. The issue isn't so much that you can't have morality. The issue again is how to ground it, and if we can't ground it, then how do we build that moral foundation, that moral commonality? Because to the point of the chess game, um, chess only works if both players both play the pieces the way they're meant to be played, follow the turns of the game, and also agree that the board itself actually matters. What I tend to find in a lot of cases is that there are presuppositions that are so ingrained, especially in our modern moral sense, uh, and and just familiarity that people take them for granted. That, like for one, that human life, like the flourishing of human life, is actually a moral good. The universe exists beautifully without any living creatures in it, and so to have the presupposition uh, that life thriving and growing, and specifically human life, or the fact that perhaps because you could conceptualize that life on Earth, many people do, that life on Earth would be better if there were no humans. In which case, propagating the human species could actually be immoral instead of moral, which brings us to a problem. We have to believe first that human thriving, human growth is actually something good. To me, a couple of people pointed out the idea of a higher power. Again, just going abstract, not even getting too Christian with it. But if unless we have some sort of higher moral orientation that we believe is worth orienting our point of view towards, we're always going to end up with points of contention. And if they're not high enough that we believe that we're all part of a human race that should work together, then conflict and death, murder, and defeat of another people group would actually be considered a moral good, because that would contribute to thriving. You would just have one infectious or cancerous group defeated by the good group, which would then move on to thrive. And so this idea of that there has to be a unifying higher framework, which tends to be the Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview, that all human life has value, and that uh, working together and moving towards a common good is actually the highest expression of human thriving, and I would say worship is something good. And I guess that's what I keep running around, is that there has to, unless we can agree on some higher, uh, at least the need for a higher, which I think you're doing here, a higher orienting point, a North Star, something beyond what we can perhaps even see, but at least are willing to test and see if it's true, then we can't actually move to a point where we can have a thriving society.
Yeah, this is. I think we talked about this earlier, but this is kind of reminds me of Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, where if morality is just a creature of consensus, then the only thing preventing you from deciding what morality is whether you have the will and the power to change the shape of the board. And it's an unappealing worldview. And I brought up Nuremberg earlier because in the face of great evil, there is an intrinsic human desire to say not just we have vanquished this evil, but that we were righteous in doing so. That there was a higher principle. There is actually something at stake here that's true and noble, and we were honoring it. And that's very different than coming out and saying, well, we had bigger guns, so we win. So we get to tell you what to do, which is a grim and horrifying reality. But I think on moral subjectivism, that's all there is.
Yeah, and to because and tell me what you think of this. As much as I've pondered it so far, I can only find 2 points of grounding morality, and that's in the concept that there is a transcendent moral being which has set laws of morality in place, much like the laws of the universe that we explore with science, and we explore morality with what we would say the social sciences. You can either anchor morality on that point, or whatever you conceptualize that, or on your own moral sense. I don't see where you have to judge morality based on your own perception. In a degree, we always have to take a subjective stance, because what we're doing is doing our best to judge whether the morality we perceive as higher we're actually correct on. We have to test and adjust. But I can only see that morality you can either affix to your own personal subjective sense, or to the belief in a higher morality that you try to be conformed to.
Daniel, I'd be curious what your thoughts on this is. I mean, I think both of us believe in a transcendent moral authority.
Yeah,
So I think we would both say yes to that. But there's an interesting question there, which is like, what's the minimum belief you would need to have to be a moral objectivist?
authority. I think authority is at the heart of it. If there's no authority, then there can never be any categorical imperatives. And by categorical imperative, that means that there's something that you ought to do, regardless of whether you want to do it or not. So a lot of moral subjectivists talk about hypothetical imperatives, like, well, if you want to live in a nice society, then you ought to do this. So that's an if categorical imperative. But that's a hypothetical imperative. But a categorical imperative is like, it doesn't matter if you want to live in a nice society or not. Even if you want to live like the Joker, you still ought to love your neighbor as you love yourself, or whatever the actual moral law is. You still have a real obligation. So one example, very simple, of this would be like if you're in the military or something. So if you're in the military, you have a real obligation to follow the rules of the commanders that are above you. So if the officer that is in charge has written out specific instructions, you have an obligation to comply with those instructions whether you want to or not. And if you do not comply with those instructions, you are in the wrong, and you can be held, and probably will be held, accountable. But if there's no authority, right, the only reason that works is because there's an authority, and that authority has to be legitimate, right? So if you walk into a bathroom stall and it says, you must have your hair such and such length, that has no authority over you. That's just writing on a wall. What's the difference between that writing on a wall and what you read when it has your commander's name, your commander's signature at the bottom of it, and it says you must have your hair at such and such length? The difference between these two statements is one is coming from a legitimate authority that has the right to tell you what to do, and the other does not. And if there's no person that has the right to tell you what to do, then I don't think you can ever get to categorical imperatives. I think it's just game, set, match. So unless there's an authority, a transcendent authority that can tell you what to do and has the actual right to do that, you're never going to get to objective morality. You're never going to get categorical imperatives. That's my view.
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't know. Maybe one of these days we'll get a Neoplatonist on who can actually defend the position, which I cannot because it's just not a view that I've spent time working on or unpacking.
So
Defend the view that like a Platonic form
yeah,
of goodness is sufficient because it's embodied in the abstract, and that we should try to do that because to be good is something that ought to be done for its own sake, and so the ought is built into the form.
yeah,
But as you said, I struggle with it because there's no. Yeah, you put this succinctly earlier. There's no examples of abstract objects having any direct impact on the world, whereas there's a tremendous amount of evidence of minds having impact on the world. So when you
yeah,
conceptualize God as a transcendent mind, and vested with that moral authority, this all kind of follows. But if you move it to a purely abstract realm,
right.
I have a hard time connecting the dots, but that could.
So
I'm open to the argument. I'd love to hear
so
someone make that argument, but I've never heard it made convincingly.
So two things. The first thing is that I'm actually in a conversation with Jeff, also known as Secular Outpost, here on Twitter, and he has responded to my moral argument, and he wrote quite a lengthy response to it, and it has two parts. I've responded to his first part, so if anybody's interested in reading that, and I'm going to respond to the second part, it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and he doesn't have a family, and I do. But I am going to respond to his second part as well. So I would definitely encourage you to read that, because he is a Neoplatonist. He is an atheist, and he is trying to say that you can ground objective morality without God. So he's making that argument. He's attacking my first premise and granting the second premise. My first premise is saying without God, you cannot get objective morality, and he's attacking that. He grants the second premise that morality is objective. So I would just strongly recommend anybody who's interested in this read that. There was an atheist, a friend of mine, who read through all of it, everything that's been written so far, and he came away from it saying atheists should not defend against the moral argument. That's what he said. And Secular Outpost is one of the best meta ethicists on Twitter, as far as I'm concerned. But this atheist read what I said, my response to Jeff, and he said, atheists have no business engaging in the moral argument. We should be moral anti realists. If we're going to be an atheist, we should just be moral anti realists. That's how strong he thought my response was. So that was his take. You guys might have different takes, but the second thing that I want to say is this idea that there's like this concept or these rules or this goodness, whatever, that's somehow in this abstract world. I don't think that that makes any sense why that would impact us. The way I think about it is if you walk into someone's house and you're in the wrong, it's because there's an owner of that house. Okay. So if I go into someone's house and I'm wearing shoes and someone says, hey, you're not allowed to wear shoes in here, you're in the wrong. Well, the only way that that can really be true and make sense is if there's an owner of that house who said, hey, here's the rule. The rule is you're not allowed to wear shoes in this house. But if you go into a house that isn't owned by anybody, it's an abandoned house, and there happen to be rules written on the wall or something, those rules mean nothing. That house is abandoned. It's not owned by anyone. There's no owner. So the rules are just on the wall. They have nothing to do with you. You can burn that house down. You can wear shoes in it. You can smoke in that house. You can do whatever you feel like doing in that house. And if there's no owner of everything, of this universe, of us, then we're in an abandoned house. And even if there are some platonic rules somewhere, it has no bearing on what we do with our lives. It's just like those rules on that abandoned house. We can do whatever we want. So that's the way that I think about it. Anyway, Brian, you want
Yeah,
to?
no,
Sorry.
the only thing I'd wrap with is because the only other interim I see between either a personal imposition of your moral sense upon the world and submitting to a transcendent um, moral anchor would be it comes up as the appeal to a group or consensus. But the problem at that point is that it changes, and if you can influence consensus, or you can choose what you believe consensus is right, you're still appealing to your own authority at that point. Anyway, it's just an interesting argument. I've tried to distill it down, and those are the only 2 points that I can't see anything beyond a transcendent morality that's or anything in between the transcendent morality and just your own moral sense yourself. I don't see an interim that's actually feasible because it all traces back to, at that point, your own moral sense, which you believe is right or wrong, and you either disagree or agree with the moral consensus of the day, with which point you're still saying that my moral sense is right and other people are wrong, which is arbitrary.
Yeah, I think that increasingly you're seeing that what I would say the intellectually rigorous and honest atheist types are openly admitting the position. Like when you watch Alex O'Connor, whose work I love, he's a moral emotivist. So he believes that moral expressions are merely, they're not, they have no truth value at all. Someone says rape and you say boo because you don't like that, but it's not. There's no truth value to your claim. It's just you expressing an emotion and like an emote on Twitter. In a sense, it's not. There's no truth to the claim at all, and I think that is the defensible position on atheism. So and if that's the view that people have, at least it flows from their presuppositions. But God, it's a really grim worldview. If if nothing else, it just seems like a horrible way to live.
Well, and it completely contradicts our actual experience too, because we don't think of morality that way. We don't think of morality as being, oh, rape, boo. We think of, oh, rape, wrong. Rape, you should have consequences, not rape, me no likey, because I wouldn't do that. So there, but whatever you want to do, go ahead. We don't think of morality like that. You go ask 100 people on the street, is it wrong to rape, like actually wrong? Even if I gave you a pill that made you think it was right, would it still be wrong to rape? And they'd be like, of course. What are you talking about? you
Well, and
know and especially,
no,
go ahead.
you're totally right. And this is the point we were talking about with atheists the other night, which is, at a certain point, if you're just saying that humans are wrong about everything, why would we think that we're right about this next thing you're about to say? Like if humans experience objective morality, but it's an illusion, we're wrong about that. And we experience free will, but it's an illusion, we're wrong about that. But also, here's my next point about atheism, and that's true. It's like, well, you just admitted you were wrong about everything in your life. So why would this next thing be right? At a certain point, it's just a self-defeating worldview.
Yeah, I think so too. I think you really you need to explain our fundamental understanding of reality. You can't just say that it's an illusion, because there are other fundamental things that we have to believe. And as soon as you start saying, well, this one's an illusion but this one is real, it's like, well, is it, or does your worldview just suck at explaining what's really going on? And you need a better worldview. But anyway, we better
Yeah, thank you guys.
we better go
I'll
to
get out.
Cuckoo Park. Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. So it's going to be Cuckoo Park and then John, and then we're going to call it a night if John is still up to speak. So Cuckoo Park, are you there?
Yeah, appreciate it. Is this Darwin I'm talking to?
Yeah, this is the Darwin.
Cool. I liked your picture on the guy who walks into the house. But so I'm just logically thinking, why would God create if there wasn't free will?
Well, I don't think that he would. I think that God has created human beings with free will, and that's how we understand morality, as something that entails free will. It's like what Ryan was saying. If you just wind something up and it does something to another thing, or like, imagine saying that a rock was immoral because it rolled down a hill and crushed a family as they're driving somewhere for a vacation, right? We wouldn't say that the rock was immoral. We would say that the situation was really unfortunate, it's a tragedy, but we wouldn't say that the rock had done something wrong, because the rock couldn't have done otherwise. The rock is just being a rock, and it's just responding to the forces around it. But it's very different than if somebody had pushed that rock, like if I had pushed the rock and knew what the rock was going to do. Well, now it's not just a tragedy, now something evil has happened because I had the real ability to not push the rock. So
Yeah, and
I
on a
don't know.
very fundamental level, I think you're asking the right question, which is like, if you believe that there is no free will, I think you will struggle to articulate any purpose or meaning to anything. I don't see how there could be not just morality. I mean, any purpose, any meaning. So like, you asked the question in terms of like, why would God have done this? I think that you could ask any question about why anything would matter, and the answer would be, in the absence of free will, it wouldn't.
Yeah, correct. And I believe that it matters morality because, I mean, Jesus came to make us live. He didn't make us to be good, even though that's what comes with it. But and he has a bunch of stuff to tell us about how we ought to behave. So, I mean, that's our morality, right? So, I believe it matters to God, but with the atheist, the honest atheist, when they're trying to tell you about morality, I think it's just a bunch of smoke being blown. They're trying, and I mean, that's one of the weakest arguments an atheist could ever make, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the atheist worldview has no justification or way to account for our actual experience of morality. That's what I argue pretty much constantly on here. So you won't hear any disagreement from me on
Yeah,
that.
I mean, you run into, I guess the phrase is compatibilists now and then, who attempt to dress it up a little bit, but I've never been convinced by it, and it's just because it always seems to me at the end of the day, the compatibilist is not saying there is free will; they're saying that the illusion is particularly convincing, and I don't see how that gets you anywhere. I think you actually have to have at least some capacity to have done something different for there to be meaning at all, even if it's not. And I'm not saying it has to be total capacity. Like, obviously, the world interacts with you and it pushes you and bends you in certain ways, and some choices are easier and some are harder. But there's got to be some choice. Otherwise, I don't see how you get any meaning from anything. It's like water from a stone.
Yeah, I think compatibilism is really just a word game, because they're really redefining free will. See, to me, it's like either you have free will, you have the real ability to have done otherwise, or you do not have the real ability to do otherwise, and that would be determinism. But they try to redefine free will, and it's really a semantic game, where you just say, oh, well, I believe in free will, or I believe that free will is compatible with determinism, but then they're not using that definition of free will. They redefine it to, well, free will means you can do whatever you want to do, something like that. And it's like, okay, but that's not what I was saying about free will, you know? So it's like, does a rock want to roll down a hill? I mean, I guess. So I think that compatibilism is a ridiculous position personally. I think it's just a word
Yeah,
game.
that type of argument has always struck me as and maybe I've never heard a good version, but it's always struck me as somewhat dishonest in that, like, you're not really grappling with the truth of the issues, you're redefining the terms. And then saying, oh, well,
Yeah,
I
I
redefined
suppose.
the words, so now the words say X. And it's like, well, okay, we all know that words could be different, but if you just change the words, you're not talking about what's true at all. You're just kind of, yeah, like you said, you're playing a semantic game.
Yeah, yeah, that happens quite a bit. All right, John, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me though?
Yeah, I hear you good. What's going
Okay.
on, man?
So I haven't done one of these before. Like, do I make an introduction or anything like that?
No, that's all right. Just give us your thoughts, man. What do you
Okay.
think?
Well, there's been a lot said over the course of the night that I vehemently disagree with, but I think that rather than trying to go through all of that, I should just articulate my position. I don't think that morality can be objective for a number of reasons. First of all, human beings aren't so good at being objective. Like, there's a reason that we have things like peer review, and even that is insufficient to the task. Um, you see, when I hear you guys talk about morally outrageous behavior, I feel like rather than demonstrating in any way that there's some objective moral standard beyond us, I think it demonstrates that we can't be objective about these types of things. It pardon me. It provokes an emotional reaction, and our reaction to it is predicated on that. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons that that is the case for our experience. Am I making sense so far?
I think so. I mean, from what I heard so far, you're saying that humans aren't objective because we feel strongly about certain moral behavior.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, couldn't it? Well, do you want to make all of your points, or do you want us to
If
respond
you,
to each
yeah,
one
if you don't mind me
as we go?
jumping in just real quickly, I don't want to speak for Daniel, but I agree with everything you've said so far. I don't think humans are capable of perfect objectivity. I think we can aspire to it, but we don't reach it.
Yeah.
But Daniel and I aren't saying that humans are objective, or that humans are moral, or that humans are even close to being objectively moral. What we're saying is that there is an objective moral standard and that humans fail to live up to it, but we ought to try our best to do so. Which is different. We're not saying that that humans are themselves objective, nor are we saying that objective morality comes from us.
Yes.
Yeah, can I just to solidify that point, John, I'm sure Ryan will agree with me here, but we're saying that morality is like truth, that it's objective. Okay, so we might never be able to fully understand the nature of reality.
Yeah.
Okay, like right now we're going way down into little itty bitty things, and we're like, okay, like we really don't know what's going on at the subatomic level, and there might be like 5 levels beneath that. Who knows? But we believe that there is actually a truth that could be known. We might never know it. We'll probably never know everything about reality, but we believe that there is a truth that could be known about reality, and we might be getting closer to knowing that truth rather than further away as we continue to investigate. And that's what Ryan and I are kind of talking about here with objective morality. So instead of reality, when it comes to morality, we believe that there is a truth that can be known about what we ought to do. So hopefully that makes
Yeah,
sense.
in philosophy, this is called an ontological versus epistemological distinction, meaning like what is versus what we know. Like I could tell
Yeah.
you that pi is 3.14, but I couldn't go beyond that, right? That's the extent of how far I've memorized pi.
Fair.
But that doesn't change my epistemology, my knowledge or lack thereof doesn't change the fact that objectively, in truth, ontologically, this number pi. It can be calculated, it can be known, and my limitations don't change that. That's separate from me.
Hmm. Well, I mean, numbers are symbols that we use to interpret like the intrinsic value of a numerical system. Like that's how we codify it, so it's no longer so abstract and it's something we can actually work with. And like morality, I think works similarly. But I don't think that there's really anything beyond us that makes it true. I think it's dangerous to conflate truth and morality. Like we can call things moral truths, and that can be our subjective experience, but like it it doesn't apply to non-humans. It is a codified system of human behavior that we've collectively developed over thousands of years. And even before we had societies, it was advantageous for survival to like look out for your troop. So like it developed in our prehistory and has accumulatively been refined over time, that it's a purely human experience.
Well, John, I want to respond to this because to me, what you're doing is you're basically giving us kind of a just so story, right? Like, this is how humans got to thinking this way. So imagine that I told you a story about how my house came to be painted purple. Okay. So there was this guy and this owner and then that owner, and it was painted this and it was painted that. And then eventually my house now has finally come to be painted purple. All right. The fact that my house now is purple tells you nothing about whether or not it is good that my house is purple or that my house ought to be purple.
Okay.
Okay. So just because we are this way, that tells us nothing about how we ought
No,
to
we
be.
decide
All
how
right. And
we
we're
ought to be and strive toward that.
right. But that's the problem, is that that's all just made up.
So what? That's the human
Well, do you
experience.
do
We
you
make it
think,
up as we go along.
well, is that really the human experience? Like, do
Seems
you
like it.
think that if I go and ask 100 people on the street, hey, there's this, my neighbor, he made up his own moral system and he's going and raping everybody. Is he actually wrong or is he fine because this is
No,
his
see,
made up moral system and
that's
he's
just
good?
the appeal to emotional outrage again. It's the same thing.
Yeah, but what would they say though?
They would probably say it's wrong. Most of us believe that's
Yeah,
wrong. That doesn't
right.
make
They
it
would say it's
objectively
wrong
wrong. Because,
regardless.
Yeah,
like, to
What's
be
that?
objective, it doesn't mean to just exist beyond a human mind. It means without any emotional or opinion considerations whatsoever. And humans just don't work that way. We like to
well,
tell ourselves that we are, but there doesn't seem to be any truth to that.
just to point this out, and obviously I know you disagree, and I don't. That's totally fine. But you're presupposing that morality is an invention of human minds, which by definition makes it subjective. So part of the disconnect is
It
that
doesn't seem to be a presupposition, though. I mean, we have a detailed record of the development of moral systems dating back thousands of years. We can trace exactly how this has developed over time.
but
John.
It's
how
not
would
like,
that prove that it's subjective? That you.
Yeah, I mean, think about it like this, John. How many different systems or theories of the shape of the earth have there been throughout
quite a
time?
few.
Like a lot, right? Yeah, quite a few. But there is an actual truth about the shape of the earth. Like, we might be wrong about our conception about the shape of the earth. Who knows? There might be some crazy data that turns out that the flat earthers have been right this whole time, and it's all conspiracy or whatever.
That hypothetical doesn't
But
seem
there,
physically possible.
well, I agree. I'm just saying that human societies have had a lot of different ideas and a lot of different conceptions about the shape of the earth, but that doesn't mean that there was never an actual objective truth about the
But
shape
the
of the earth. And
analogy
in the
fails
same
because
way,
the earth is a physical fact and we can measure it, and morality doesn't work that way.
well, we're saying that morality is the
But
same
it
way.
isn't.
And just because you can measure something, that the when we talk about something being objective, it doesn't mean that we can measure it. Like, maybe we never learned how to measure the shape of the earth. Even if we couldn't measure the shape of the earth, it still would have a shape ontologically. Like, it would be the case that the earth would have a shape regardless of whether we could measure it. And so, in the same way, morality, whether or not we can measure it or even know it, we're saying we believe that it is objective, that there are actual truths when it comes to moral questions, like, is it wrong to rape? Does that
It
make
is for
sense?
humans as far as I'm concerned, but like, we're far from the only species that engages in that kind of behavior. And like, it's such an icky example. Like, this is one of the things that definitely provokes an emotional reaction from me personally. I find it extremely distasteful to even like discuss the subject, frankly. But like, yeah, that to me demonstrates the lack of objectivity here. And I really think we're fooling ourselves by placing it in anything really beyond stuff that we have constructed as acceptable moral behavior.
So I think the problem is there. I mean, look, there's a purpose. There's a perfectly defensible articulation that morality is an illusion, and it's a
Well, it's not an illusion. We very deliberately constructed it to maintain a cohesive
yeah.
society.
It's not actually a real thing. It's a thing humans
It's a
constructed for
thing
the
we
reason.
invented,
Yeah,
like
and
money
people,
or like most
yeah.
anything else.
Okay,
And
so
there are versions of this argument, but I think the entailments are profoundly upsetting. Like, so let's start. We talked about Nazi Germany earlier, and the reason we bring that example up is that if morality is merely a human construct, as you say it is, that is designed to enforce social cohesion and order, then the logical entailment is that if the Nazis had won, then they would have been moral.
See, you're undermining your own point when you make an appeal to emotional outrage. Like, I don't
I'm not
understand why you
making
guys don't
appeals.
see that.
I'm not
You,
making appeals.
you don't have to be upset in order to understand that the Nazis were morally
Oh
wrong,
no, not at
John.
all.
That
But like,
I think that you're conflating, like, the idea of emotions with objectivity, with more objective
Well,
morality.
and
You
more
know,
fundamentally, there would be no basis for which to say they were wrong, because if they had won, then their consensus would be enforced. And on this view, morality is merely a social construct which is enforced. So their view would be the one that is being enforced. So by definition, they would be correct, because there is no transcendent definition of morality to appeal to.
no, we have our own innate senses. Like, even if that was the lie of the land, as it were, I would still take issue with it. But that doesn't make it objective either.
yeah, but John, what we're trying to get at is, you don't like the Nazis. The Nazis don't like you. You say the Nazis are wrong based on your moral
Yep.
standard. The Nazis say that you're wrong based on their moral standard. Is there an actual truth about who is right and who is wrong? If you're looking at the earth and you say the earth is round, and the Nazis are looking at the earth and they're saying no, it's flat, is there an actual truth about the matter, or are you all just saying stuff and it has nothing to do with reality?
See, again,
Okay.
the earth actually exists. Like, it is a demonstrable fact. Morality doesn't work that way. So the
Well,
analogy doesn't work.
John, can I ask you a quick question? Yeah, I'm from your comments, I'm assuming you're a metaphysical naturalist. Is that right?
No, not really. I am sort of doing my own thing. I don't really fit
I'm not
into
sure
any
John knows what a
definitional.
metaphysical
Well,
naturalist
I
is.
guess what I'm getting at,
You might
John, is
want to
that
unpack that.
I would tend to agree with you that anybody who argues for an objective moral standard, one of our entailments on our side of the fence is that you have to be a supernaturalist. You can't argue for a moral standard and at the same time argue that everything that we can know about the universe can be discovered through science, because, as you said, morality does not appear to be something that can be discovered in the way that the shape of the earth can be discovered. I
Yeah,
think it can be discovered, but it's not discovered in the same way. So
certainly not.
I would agree with you that metaphysically, to be a moral objectivist, you would have to have some degree of supernaturalism in your worldview. It sounds like you don't, which is what I was getting at.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be the case to me, and I've really, really looked for it.
Yeah, I don't know. Um, I think that if something were to happen to you, John, I think you wouldn't need to look for it. I think you would just be like, "Hey, that was wrong," and it's not just
No, I mean in
because.
terms of supernatural stuff. Like,
Oh, you mean like God?
I mean like God or ghosts or Bigfoot or really anything that I couldn't figure out what was actually going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing for Bigfoot, but I think the thing about talking about God, which I put in the broad category of supernaturalism, which is just a philosophical term for belief in beyond naturalism, is that I don't think I've ever heard of anybody who has been convinced of the existence of God because of a clever logical argument. No
Oh,
one,
definitely
no
not.
one reads the Kalam cosmological argument and goes, "Oh, okay, that's it. There's God." But I do think what happens is we have conversations like this, and these arguments that are formal and logical for the existence of God. There's numerous of them, and some of them you might find compelling, and some you might not. But they're
I
worth
have yet
looking
to
into.
find any that are
Well,
compelling.
in any case, you read them, and then, as what I think Daniel was getting at, you have an experience, and the
Yeah.
experience you have opens your mind to the idea that your frame of reference might be very limited and that there are things beyond your ken that you're grappling with. And then you return to these arguments and they're a little bit more interesting. But it's never just the arguments. It's always an experience, because I just don't think that people can be convinced to believe through logical argumentation in that way. I don't know, Daniel. Maybe you've been doing this more than me, so maybe you've managed to sway
Hmm.
somebody through logic alone. But I just haven't seen that happen.
Um, uh, my journey kind of actually is like that, but that's definitely the exception. And you really do have to be open to it. And I tell people all the time, I make arguments, I make logical arguments, I argue with atheists, but I don't expect any of my arguments to convince anybody. And I think that my arguments are great, but whether my arguments are the best arguments in the world or not, I don't think it matters. I pretty much agree with you. Somebody actually has to be seeking. They have to actually be looking. And it's a long journey, typically, especially if you're an atheist. It's a long journey. It took me years. So
Hmm.
I don't ever expect for someone to listen to something that I say and be like, now I believe in God. Now it makes
Yeah.
sense, because that's just not how it works. It's a long, long
That's a
journey.
great idea
So,
for a space, by the way. How people either found or lost their faith. That's an interesting topic.
Yeah, because I kind of went
yeah.
like the opposite direction the more I learned about it.
Yeah. Well, maybe you and I will do a space, John. Would you be interested in that?
Yeah, I would.
I have
Awesome.
a question for you.
Well, we better get out of here, Ryan. We went way over time.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you hosting, and everybody who's listening. I would just encourage you, if you're interested in this type of conversation, follow Daniel. If you don't mind me being forward, follow me, and follow each other, because that's how we develop communities where people are going to have these conversations on this platform.
Yep.
Hey,
All
just real
right.
quick, Daniel.
Good night, everyone.
I just,
Then I
wa-
suppose.
I just wanted to say this real quick, man. I just really find the argument that things like rape, incest, pedophilia, bestiality, mutilation, torture, and murder, that these are subjective and relative. I find that argument very unpersuasive, very heinous, and honestly very degrading. And this is how I feel about it. I feel like these things are obviously objective.
Well, you won't get any objection from me on that. But yeah, so we've went way over time, but I do just want to say thank you very much to everybody who has listened. I really appreciate all of you, and I really appreciate everyone who came up and spoke. Uh, Even the atheists, especially maybe the atheists. You know, it's difficult when you're in this type of space with Christians and everything to come up and maybe be disagreed with and all of that. So I really appreciate that, especially John, because I haven't actually got to talk to him before. But anyway, yeah, I think that this topic is really important. You know, the idea of subjective morality versus objective morality. I really do think that this is seriously going to affect your society. And if we continue going down this postmodernist road where we're like, what is truth? Morality is just subjective. There's no actual objective truth about it. It's just my preferences and all that. Then we're really opening ourselves up to some really, really bad stuff. And so these conversations matter. They matter a lot to me. I think anybody who knows me knows that. And hopefully we can continue the conversation. And I'd like to do another space on this, maybe a few more, honestly. And Ryan, thank you so much for doing this with me. I really appreciate it. I think this was a great idea. This was all Ryan's idea, guys. So please give him a follow. I think he did a fantastic job as my co host. He pretty much ran everything and made this really easy for me. So, really appreciate you, Ryan. Great job. And it was wonderful getting to talk to you for the first time. So, hopefully, we'll get to talk again
Yeah,
soon.
thanks so much. This was a real pleasure. Hope to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, with that, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I know that there were some people that were requesting, and I'm sorry about that. But anyway, thank you guys so much for being here. I got to get to bed. So, y'all have a wonderful night and God bless.